Across a sunlit Hudson Valley lawn, a wealthy widower paused, and the gardener he'd hired glanced up, sweat on his brow, kindness in his eyes. Their world said no. Their hearts said maybe. This is a gentle story about boundaries, courage, and two men choosing love anyway. On a weekday. If this kind of caring, hopeful storytelling nourishes you, please tap like, subscribe, and share with someone who enjoys a warm, steady voice. Settle in with tea, breathe easy, and join me to the end. Your support helps us keep telling tender, thoughtful stories without rushing. Thank you sincerely, friends. The morning Henry Dalton first really saw him, the grass was still sparkling from a light September rain, and the last of the fog was drifting like ghostly silk across the Hudson. It was a Tuesday, and Henry had come out early because he couldn't sit through another conference call involving a new wing for the foundation without stepping into real air. His physicians liked to remind him that moving around wasn't the same as moving forward, and he used to resist that. But lately he had come to understand what they meant. He was 50. He had survived a marriage that ended kindly but firmly, and a decade of building a company that no longer required his fingerprints on every decision. The house on the river, with its terraces and tall windows and lemon trees and terracotta planters, sat like a steady pulse in his life. It was beautiful. It was orderly. It was his. And sometimes it was too quiet. Caleb Brooks was near the rose hedge, turning soil with care. The hedge had been planted by someone else, long before either of them had arrived at this address, but the upkeep had fallen to the man with the gentle hands and sun-browned forearms. Henry wasn't someone who thought of himself as dramatic, so he was startled by how immediate the sight felt, as if a door had opened in a room he hadn't realized was dim. Caleb's t-shirt clung where sweat darkened it, and a leaf had stuck to his neck, and his smile, when he noticed Henry, was small and courteous. "Morning, Mr. Dalton," Caleb said. Henry lifted a hand. "Good morning, Caleb." He could have left it there. He often did with staff. There is a kindness in respecting someone's time while they work. But he stepped closer. He was not 20. He had learned that small conversations, when underestimated, are exactly where life grows. "What are we doing here today?" he asked, spreading his palms toward the hedge. Caleb, who wore gloves the color of wet soil, straightened and glanced across the beds, as if to include Henry in their care. The koi pond overflowed in the night with the rain, and it pushed a rush of silt this way. "Roses don't like to have their feet soggy," he smiled again. "I'm loosening the surface so the roots can breathe." "Let them breathe," Henry murmured, and then realized how intimate that sounded, how he'd said it as if the roses were family sitting at his table. He laughed softly in apology. "I like that you talk about them like living things, not decorations." "They're living, sir," Caleb said, and there was a kind patience in the way he pointed toward the thorned canes and subtle new growth. "Everything is a conversation. Soil, sun, pruning, time. You listen, and they tell you what they need. People aren't that different." It was the sort of sentence that would have sounded rehearsed if it hadn't landed so easily from him. Henry studied the man for a second, then nodded. "We hire the right people," he said, and immediately felt how inadequate it was to reduce the moment to staffing. I'm glad you're here." Caleb's green eyes warmed. "I'm glad to be here. This is where it would be nice to say fireworks started." That isn't how real lives work, especially lives that have endured. Something quieter began, more like the steady sound of water in the background. Henry went inside to shower and sit through the briefing, but while he listened to graphs, he found that his mind kept returning to the smell of wet earth and the way Caleb's body leaned slightly toward every rose as if to hear it better. When the meeting was over, he didn't feel as trapped as he usually did on a Tuesday. He learned about Caleb slowly, as one learns a place by walking it. He learned that Caleb was 33 and had grown up near Dayton, Ohio. He learned that he had served in the Army and, after coming home, had enrolled in a horticulture program because it soothed him to place his hands in soil and see what could be repaired. He learned that he laughed softly while talking about tomatoes and spoke with care about his mother, who still called him every Sunday afternoon. He learned that he liked old blues and that he had a scar on his wrist in a place where a thorn had punished him for rushing a spring pruning. He learned that he drank his coffee black and never left the water spigots dripping. Henry found himself outside more often. He wore a jacket sometimes because he ran cold, and he took an apple with him to have a reason to be there. He listened when Caleb explained that the oaks at the edge of the property needed attention, and he asked whether they could plant a handful of milkweed to give the monarchs a place to pause on their way south. Caleb's face brightened. "Yes," he said. "Yes, we can." The staff were good at their jobs and kindly with their boss. Joy, who ran Henry's kitchen and had been with him since the previous house in the city, sometimes watched him step out toward the lawn at odd hours. She would smile without comment, placing scones on a plate when he returned. Joy liked romance as a general principle, but she also liked good boundaries. She watched him the way one watches a dear friend mid-crossing. What made it complicated, of course, was the line. It's important to name that line. Henry paid for the property. He paid a landscaping company to care for it. That company paid Caleb. It isn't romantic to imagine that power doesn't alter how a conversation feels. It does. And yet there is also honor in being honest about longing. When Henry thought late at night about the decades that stretched behind him, a clean quiet settled on him, the kind that comes after a storm. He was not broken, but he had known plenty of empty rooms. He had provided for employees and for his son Evan. He had given speeches and checks. He had been called Sir far too often to remember the first time. He wanted something that asked him to be Henry, not Mr. Dalton. So, he moved with care. It rained hard again that Friday, a coastal storm that swung up the river and leaned on the valley with the old might of weather. The house held steady, modern and solid, but the grounds were ancient in their reaction. Runoff slid in new patterns, the low gardens filled, and late peonies bent their shoulders as if relieved to have an excuse. Caleb stayed late with Marla, his supervisor from the landscaping company, shoring the path by the boxwoods to keep it from collapsing into the lower yard. A soaked sweatshirt clung to him. His laugh came out breathless but true. "Get inside," Marla told him at 6, pushing rain from her eyes. "We can do the rest tomorrow." "You're no good to me, drowned. I'll cover the tool shed and head home," he said. "I'll be done in 10. Henry, of course, had been offering them towels and hot coffee in a dry garage, but professionals try not to invade private spaces unless necessary. When the gutters finally stopped beating their rhythm, Henry found Caleb sealing a bag of leaf litter like a dry pillow. "Joy made soup," Henry said. "Chicken and rice. You can bring a bowl home." He didn't mention that the road sometimes flooded at the low spot, and that one bowl of soup was not worth a fender. He didn't mention that he had already told Joy to put 2 bowls by the counter. Caleb looked like a man who wanted to say thanks but decline. He took a breath and nodded instead. "That would be kind," he said. "Thank you." Inside, the kitchen was warm. Joy had left. She trusted adults to take care of themselves, and she had also added a note on the counter that said, "Please eat while warm. Mr. Dalton, you need the calories." Henry smiled at her knowing voice even when she wasn't in the room. He placed a bowl before Caleb and poured a cup of tea for himself, knowing coffee at this hour would rob him of rest. They ate without pretending not to be hungry. The rain eased on the roof and the window blurred with leftover fog. "Do you ever get tired of being here?" Caleb asked gently after a time. "Sometimes I wonder with larger houses if they can feel like museums." "Sometimes," Henry said. "But people braiding on the stairs and children running with sandwiches also turn houses into museums. We worship what we survived. I like the morning light in the library. And at night, there's a sound the house makes, like the river itself is breathing through the vents." He blew across his tea. "Do you get tired of being outside?" "Never," Caleb said, and then smiled toward understatement. "Almost never. I sleep well when I've earned it." Henry felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't realized had been tight. The world had been heavy on him for so long that he'd mistaken heaviness for the texture of reality. Here it felt different. He told Caleb about the first time Evan caught a fish in the river, and how he'd been too proud and afraid to take it off the hook himself. He laughed at his own softness. Caleb told Henry about Ohio, about the way the wind moved like a long rope across the fields, and how he'd learned to respect heat and lightning both. He spoke about service, not as a row of medals, but as a difficult season that taught him to slow his heart on purpose. For a while, they simply existed in the same room. Henry noticed that his tea cooled at a normal rate, not too fast, not too slow. When Caleb stood to leave, he didn't hover. He rinsed his bowl. He thanked Henry in a manner that acknowledged food had been shared and not bestowed. At the door, something caught, just the cuff of his sleeve on a latch. Henry reached to help without thinking, and his hand closed briefly around Caleb's wrist as the fabric wiggled loose. There it was, warmth, a living man, the kind of touch that informed and did not invade. Caleb's eyes met his. No one spoke a cliché, and yet everything common and beautiful was present in the way they nodded and let go. After he left, Henry stood a while in the entry. The storm was done, and he could hear the late train downriver sounding its horn in a long, comforting sweep. He slept that night like someone had placed a warm stone where his heart had been chattering. We should pause here for a second, kindly, to acknowledge that this story involves people who have to be careful. It is not small to fall for someone who stewards your property, and yet humans are not only their titles. Henry knew this, and Caleb knew this, and so the next days they behaved with a care that did not deny their humanity. Henry notified Marla that he wanted to switch to a retainer arrangement with the firm that would lessen direct supervision from him. The lawyers had a few neat suggestions that meant, in practical terms, that Henry would speak to Marla about schedules while she spoke to Caleb about work. It was not the same as being free of the line, but it was better than standing on it. When Caleb found out about the change, he sought Henry and said, "Thank you." Henry shook his head. "I did it for both of us," he said. "I like talking to you, and I also like doing this the right way." Something steady moved behind Caleb's expression. "I like doing things the right way, too." October chilled and colored the hills. Henry hosted a fundraiser for the foundation, a late-afternoon event with a string quartet and too many pastries arranged on white plates. People moved across the terrace in expensive shoes, and the Hudson pretended to be a painting for their benefit. Vivian Park, who sat on Henry's board and had been on the phone with him twice that week about naming rights for a clinic, arrived in a slate-gray sheath and salmon scarf. She took Henry's arm and pretended he was hers for the purposes of their donors. This is how such events often go. It is less cynical than it sounds. People like to be placed in a story, and sometimes the story requires a tableau. Caleb was elsewhere during the event because that, too, was respectful. He had spent the morning ensuring that the outdoor heaters worked and that the path to the tent was dry. During the toasts, he checked one last stubborn sprinkler and then stopped behind the west hedge, where he could hear the music but not see the donors. He didn't want to stare across a room where he was not a guest. His heart was steady, but he was not indifferent. Later, after the guests had left and the caterer was sweeping glass and laughter into the night, Henry walked the lawn to check the heaters. He found Caleb near the hedge, touching its leaves as if to wish it a good evening for helping. They stood quietly a while. The air smelled like cinnamon and damp wool. "You did well," Henry said, and it could have sounded as if he owned the praise, but it came out like a genuine fact. "Everything looked calm on top because of what you did below." "I'm paid to care," Caleb replied, and then he smiled, unwilling to let the line serve as a wall. "I care too. You would be forgiven for wishing they would kiss right there, with the heater humming and the river sending up mist." They did not. They did something better for the long road. They confessed gently and without staging that they liked one another. Henry said it in a simple, patient way. "I think about you when you're not here. I shouldn't have to say that at this age, but there it is." Caleb pressed his lips together and nodded. He said, "I think about you too," and his hand brushed against the hedge as if he needed to steady something that wasn't in danger of falling. They didn't rush past the truth. They walked alongside it. They agreed to take one step and then the next, and to name it if the older man's power put shadows on the younger man's decisions. They promised not to test each other without asking. It sounds clinical to say it out loud, but it felt like kindness in their mouths. They were making a path they could trust. One night, about a week later, Henry cut his palm on a stubborn spice jar lid at the kitchen counter. It was not dramatic, but it was annoying and unexpectedly tender. He took a breath the way you do when pain surprises you, and he made his way to the sink, feeling too much blood for such a small indignity. He was trying to cut gauze with his other hand when he heard the back door open. Caleb had come by to drop an end-of-season invoice from Marla, trying to be efficient. He stepped into the kitchen and stopped. "Hold, please," Caleb said, and in the way he said it was the calm of a medic who had dealt with worse. He washed his hands, touched Henry's wrist, and guided the cut under steady water. He set a towel there into Henry's palm and told him to squeeze gently. He looked at Henry, not the wound. "You're not alone," he said. "That helps." It did. The bleeding slowed, and they wrapped the palm. Caleb's breath was close. He smelled like the herb garden, cut mint and soil. When he looked up, the height gap between them closed because they both leaned. The kiss they shared would be easy to describe if we were counting seconds, but time is poor at measuring this. It was a brief kiss, gentle but not shy. And then the second one, which was less about learning and more about being glad to already know. They stopped there because they had promised to be slow. They pressed their foreheads together, two adults who understood that restraint is not absence. It is presence with intention. "Okay," Henry whispered. His voice had the little laugh in it that comes when you are grateful enough to be nervous. "Okay?" "Okay," Caleb said, and the word was like a coat around them in the thin air by the sink. You might think the next day would be easier or harder. In truth, it was both. Joy smiled when she saw the bandage on Henry's hand and raised her eyebrows. He lifted his shoulders and said, "Jar attack." Joy shook her head, the way older sisters do when a man clearly needs supervision. Meanwhile, the landscaping schedule was routine. Caleb spent the morning cutting back perennials, and he carried a new lightness as if someone had loosened a knot behind his ribs. They didn't meet eyes in a room full of people. They didn't sneak notes. They didn't tempt fate. They each worked and, in spare moments, thought of how careful joy can feel like the strongest kind. Of course, someone noticed something. It's not that gossip is inevitable. It's that attention follows tenderness because tenderness changes how people move. Vivian Park called Henry a week later and said, with a tone that had nothing to do with scarves, "I've heard you've been spending time with the ground staff. You know how these things play." Henry was walking the terrace when she said it. He stopped and watched a hawk slip along the ridge. "I spend time with many kinds of people," he said, which was both true and insufficient. Vivian sighed. "You know what I mean. You are in a season where rumors won't help the work. People will make a story and use your name without permission. Protect yourself. Protect the work. Protect," Henry repeated thoughtfully. He was not a hypocrite. He knew she wasn't wrong about the world. He also knew that protection sometimes becomes a word that means hide who you are. He had done that for stretches of his life, when it seemed pragmatic to be a man who was so useful in public that his private heart could wait. He was tired of waiting. "Thank you for caring," he said softly to Vivian. "I will be careful. The kind of careful that honors a person, not the kind that disappears them." He hung up and sat in the sun until it moved and he had to follow it to keep his shoulder warm. He practiced the sentences he needed to say to Evan. Not because he thought his son would be unkind. Evan, who spent his 20s building water filtration systems, and who brought home women and then later men with equal frequency and apologies only about the dog hair. No, Evan would be good. But a man rehearses when it matters, even when he doesn't have to. The rehearsal is how he shows respect to who he'll be when he speaks. When he finally called, Evan was making dinner in his Brooklyn apartment. You could hear a pan in the background and the sound of someone humming without realizing it. "Hey, Dad," he said warmly. "All right?" "All right," Henry said. He told him about the fundraiser. He told him about a hawk. He told him about Caleb without apologizing for any of it. He spoke about age in a way that made age a gift, not a burden. He said, "I find myself liking a man who is good. I want to do it properly." Evan was quiet for a second in the generous way he had trained himself to be, a pause in which a person can gather their courage and joy. Then he exhaled. "I like the idea of you liking something," he said.
Does he treat you well?
Yes, Henry said.
I treat him well, too.
And the work stuff? Evan asked gently, but he didn't linger there the way an outsider might. He knew his father knew. He said, I trust you. I'm glad you're alive, Dad. I'm glad you're alive, Henry said. And then they both laughed because the sappiness was so satisfying. Outside of the family circle, someone with a camera did what someone with a camera does in a world where everything is an opportunity. A photo surfaced online of Caleb and Henry standing in the parking area by the old oak, Henry's hand briefly on Caleb's shoulder as he looked at something on a clipboard. It wasn't a kiss. It was a human hand acknowledging a human shoulder. Nevertheless, the heading was enough. Reclusive philanthropist's new flame? It spread the way poorly phrased things do. It is in moments like that when stories tend to collapse toward either tragedy or farce. But real people have more options than a headline grants them. Henry called his foundation staff into the conference room and said quietly, I'm living a human life. There is nothing to manage except tone. Please respond to inquiries with nothing but respect. We don't trade on other people's work or their private families. One of his communications people, a kind woman named Kira, asked, Do you want to get ahead of it with a statement? He considered the urge to preempt. No, if we speak, we do so to protect others. We do not confirm or deny what doesn't require public comment. When he told Caleb, the younger man nodded. I can stand, he said, using the vocabulary he had learned in circumstances far harsher than gossip. But I don't want to cost you work. You are not a cost, Henry said, and his voice held something it had not in many years. If a friend can't withstand the idea that I like someone decent, they were an acquaintance. If a donor leaves because I'm human, another donor will come. The work is bigger than one person's discomfort, even if that person writes big checks. He smiled gently. You're not a scandal. You're a person. Caleb's posture shifted as if someone had taken a weight and relocated it to where he could carry it better. And you're not my project, he said. I like you. That's it. That's the news. Sometimes tender laurel wreaths arrive in the strangest packages. Vivian, who had wavered because she knew the worst of the world and had learned to outmaneuver it, sent Henry a text. It read, Understood. Dinner soon? When they met, she admitted, You're right. Protection is one thing. Hiding is another. I forget that I'm allowed to do some things with a pure heart. She lifted her glass, not to toast romance, but to toast a clean conscience. Proceed with care, she said, smiling. The good kind. Even good, careful love involves sorting out the practical. Caleb loved his job, but he didn't want to always be walking a hedge around his own life. He talked to Marla about moving to a city park initiative he had been eyeing for a while, a horticultural project renovating a neglected green. It would be honest work, and it would pay less, and it would be his without cross-currents. Marla supported him. She had known men who burned out trying to keep balance in the wrong shoes. Go, she said. Grow your own set of beds. Visit when you're not wearing the badge. Henry felt relief and loss braided together when Caleb told him. I'll miss seeing you when I step outside, he admitted. But I'll like seeing you because I wanted to see you, not because the irrigation broke. We'll still check your irrigation, Caleb said, grinning. I know you. You'll keep your hands out of the drip lines, promise me. Henry held up both palms, one bandage less now, the skin knitting. Promise, he said solemnly. They began to do ordinary things together. It is astonishing how satisfying ordinary things can be after a life of grand gestures. They went to the farmer's market on a Saturday and bought apples they both sampled first because neither of them trusted a sign that says Honeycrisp without verifying. They drove north to a small town where a library had stained glass nobody expected, and sat at a wooden table reading in the quiet way of people who are together and also alone in the best way. They walked a trail along the river where the ground was soft with needles and the air smelled like last year's pine. And they didn't talk for 10 minutes, not because they had nothing to say, but because words do not always improve a scene. One evening, Henry brought Caleb to a small jazz club in the city where he knew the owner. They sat in a booth while a trumpet made a sound like hope just before you get it. They were not hiding, but neither were they posing. A man at the bar glanced at them longer than necessary and then glanced away. The sky outside was the kind of blue that almost aches. Caleb tapped his fingers on Henry's wrist in rhythm to the ride symbol, and Henry thought without drama that if his heart stopped right then, he would not feel cheated. He leaned in. "I'm happy," he whispered. Caleb looked at him like someone who understands that happiness is a living animal. "Me too," he said. Caleb's mother had a stroke in November. It was sudden, and the kind of news that reorders any week like cards. Caleb called from a hospital in Ohio and spoke with adult, rattled courtesy. Henry listened and said the only true thing a person can say in such a moment that doesn't pretend to make it better. "I love you," he said. "I'm on my way if you want me to be." "I want you," Caleb said, and the word wasn't elegant, it was exact. Driving through the night at their age might be unwise. Henry did not drive through the night. He booked a morning flight, and he packed a small bag with the exact calm with which he had folded onesies a quarter-century before. He told Joy where he would be and asked her to water the ficus if he forgot. He texted Evan to say, "Caleb's mom." Evan replied, "Go, be family. Hospitals are like airports. Everyone is traveling through something heavy." Henry's coat felt too good against the plastic chairs. He brought coffee for nurses who were too polite to accept, and he tucked extra creamers into a pocket because he had learned that hospital coffee often tastes better when given options. He found Caleb by a window where the Ohio sky lay pale and offering. Caleb's shoulders fell when he saw him, the way a man's shoulders fall when someone arrives who has promised to stand next to him. They sat, sometimes with their fingers linked and sometimes with their hands apart because forms had to be signed. They took turns answering questions. Henry didn't pretend to be a son. He sat like a man who had practiced listening and found dignity there. Caleb's mother, whose name was Ruth, slept in a drifting way that made it unclear where dreams stopped. When she woke, Henry introduced himself with gentle clarity. "I'm Henry," he said. "I care about your son." Ruth, who had a mouth that liked to make wry shapes even when her body was tired of working so hard, made one. "I can see that," she whispered. "Good. This is the part that will sound too neat, but we are not writing a fairy tale. We are remembering when things can be right." Ruth improved. Caleb learned to help lift gently, to walk slowly in the hallways without rushing, to laugh at the television in the family area when an old comedian did a bit he had seen with his mother as a child. He and Henry took shifts and slept in the very specific way one sleeps on narrow sofas. One afternoon, Caleb laid his head on Henry's shoulder and napped for 20 minutes. In that time, a man in scrubs walked by and, because his own life had taught him to be brave in little kindnesses, covered them with a clean blanket without waking them. When Caleb woke, he tucked the blanket fold as if saving it for later, and looked at Henry in a way that said the world held both pain and mercy, and he was not surprised by either. On the flight home, they didn't speak for long stretches. Henry read the same page 3 times because the inside of his chest was full of something too practical to be called love and too urgent to be anything else. He held Caleb's hand where the seat belted them both into the same small row. The plane lifted and sank, and they went where they needed to be. The first snow came early. It was one of those snows that seemed to have been waiting just off stage. The river gathered itself and held still. Henry and Caleb walked the property, not as boss and worker, but as 2 men who knew that geography matters. Caleb reached down to brush snow from a small evergreen that tended to sulk. He laughed when it bounced back. "Drama queen," he said. Henry, who had always liked a dramatic flourish in art and hated it in boardrooms, nodded at the shrub as if thanking it for the show. They had not decided whether to tell the world exactly what they were, because they understood that the world would label them regardless, but they told their world. They ate dinner with Evan and his friends, who brought a pie and 3 contradictory salad dressings. They visited Joy's daughter's bakery when she cut the ribbon on a new location, and stood in the back, clapping while people said her name into a microphone. Vivian sent them a bottle of excellent wine for the holidays with a card that said, "To warmth." Marla sent a text with a photograph of the west hedge covered in snowcaps and a simple, "Look who's wearing hats." Caleb replied with hearts he wouldn't have had the nerve to text a year before. We can't talk about love without talking about fear. There were nights when Henry woke at 3 with the old business of worry, counting something invisible. He would find Caleb beside him, breathing, and count that instead. He would think about how many times he had failed to reach for things that might have been good because he was too busy being strong. He would lay a hand on Caleb's back and feel breath lift it like a small tide. Sometimes Caleb woke and placed his palm over Henry's hand, a suture of touch in the dark. They did not live forever above the ground. They had arguments like people do. They fought once in January about a weekend plan. Henry had promised to say yes to a gala he didn't want to attend, and Caleb had said he didn't want to be introduced as a friend from the garden. He didn't say it with a bite. He said it with grief. Henry flushed, not because he had meant to be careless, but because carelessness was the old habit that lived in the walls. They took a walk instead of forcing a resolution. The air scolded their lungs a little as they crossed the frozen lawn. When they turned back toward the house, they were both less interested in being right. "I'm sorry," Henry said first. "You are not an accessory to my life." "I'm sorry too," Caleb said. "I know you don't think like that. I carried a few extra pounds into that conversation that didn't belong to you. This is what it looks like when people repair." They came inside, and Henry placed his phone on the counter as if to tell it that it didn't get to direct the day. Caleb leaned on the door frame and breathed in the way men breathe when they have decided to stay instead of leave. They ate soup. They made plans that weren't a compromise so much as an invention. At the end of March, the snow retreated as if embarrassed by how dramatic it had been. The crocuses stuck up their hands like questions. Caleb had been working at the city project for a few months by then, and he came home in the evenings with that kind of tired you are proud of witnessing in someone you love. He told Henry about a teenager who had volunteered and learned the names of 5 trees and how the boy had said, "I didn't know trees had names," and how pleasure had lit his voice. Henry told Caleb about a grant application that had seemed impossible and then gone through, because a calm conversation ended up being worth more than a flashy pitch. They didn't make a big speech when they planted bulbs around the oak in April. They brought a bucket that had been used for 100 other small tasks. They knelt. Henry's joints creaked the way joints creak, and Caleb's knee popped once and made him laugh in surprise. They placed each bulb as if it mattered, which it does. Some would take, some would fail, but that isn't a reason not to plant. The ground was cool and forgiving. A hawk called above them, and a train downriver answered in kind. They tamped the soil with their palms and didn't worry that they weren't doing it with a ceremonial spoon. They were making a future that blooms underground first. Near sunset, Henry stood and brushed soil off his hands. Caleb reached over to help dust his jacket. They stood there, 2 men on a lawn in the United States of America, older and younger but not reduced to that, rich and working, but not confined to those costumes. They had promised to proceed with care, and they did. They were not a scandal. They were a story in which consent and kindness made room for desire and humor and soup and a trip to the hospital and 100 other small acts that make a life. Henry looked at Caleb. "Do you feel like this is enough?" he asked, not testing him, just checking the fit like a tailor taps a sleeve. Caleb nodded. "It's more than I knew to ask for," he said. "And it's exactly what I want." He took Henry's hand in the ordinary daylight the way people have taken hands since hands were made. The river breathed. The house made its house sounds. Joy turned on the kitchen light and looked out, and when she saw them, she smiled and shook her head and put 2 bowls on the counter, because some rituals are worth keeping. If you have ever found yourself standing where an old rule used to be, wondering whether to cross, know this: it is not naughty to choose tenderness. It is not rebellious to want to be well. It is wise to name the line and then, with mutual respect, to create a gate. Henry and Caleb opened a gate that day, and many days after, and because they did, spring came in ways the forecast did not capture. They woke to birds that weren't there last year. They noticed that the milkweed was thriving. They noticed that the river has a way of loosening the heart of the land, and that love, when tended with the right mix of patience and courage, does the same for a human life. They didn't marry that spring for anyone waiting for a ring. They didn't rush toward the altar like people on television. They sat on a bench and watched the sky work, and they let what was true continue to be true. They were a rich man and his hot gardener in a world that loves shortcuts and jokes, and they did not allow themselves to become a punchline. They chose to become shelter. They welcomed friends. They let neighbors see them walking a dog they borrowed from Evan on weekends. They had their photographs taken on purpose at a fundraiser and stood close and comfortable without worrying about captions. On a warm night in June, they hosted a small dinner under string lights in the back. An easy table with grilled vegetables and chicken and mint iced tea that Joy had brewed too strong on purpose. Vivian sat on one end and Evan on the other, and everyone talked across the long wood as if it were a single conversation. After dessert, which involved strawberries and a shortcake Joy swore was no trouble, Henry stood, not to make a speech about tax deduction, but to thank the people who had made the impossible ordinary. "Thank you," he said, looking at Caleb in particular, and then at the rest, for caring about what matters, for moving slowly when slow is wisest, and for letting me be a person, not a rumor. Caleb squeezed his fingers under the table where only Henry could feel. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to, not with a garden growing around them that had been tended and repaired and waited for. Later still, when the plates had been cleared and the string lights shimmered with the small effort it takes to stay lit, Henry and Caleb walked out to the oak. The bulbs they had planted were up, green and sturdy, and insisting on their purpose. They didn't point at them and brag. They reached down and brushed leaves like greeting a child who had learned a new word. Then they sat beneath the tree and leaned together and listened to the insects sing the patient, tireless songs they've sung forever. And they let themselves be held by a world they had chosen to trust. If love were only fireworks, it might be easy to dismiss it as a spectacle, but love, as they lived it, was closer to a deep breath. It was the doctor-like calm of remembering that the body heals when given the right conditions. It was the elder wisdom of saying, "Take your time," when every billboard yelled, "Hurry." It was two good men finding that forbidden is often just a word for a door no one has walked through with a reasonable plan. In fall, when the leaves flared again and the river rehearsed its winter songs, they took a photograph together because Joy made them, and because someday, someone would want to see it and remember. In the picture, Henry's hair is silvering at the temples and Caleb's eyes are laugh-bright. The oak is behind them, big and unembarrassed. It is not a magazine cover. It is not a campaign. It is a record that, in a time and place full of noise, two men on an American lawn learned how to listen for what matters and, hearing it, chose to stay.